My name is Alvin Smith. I'm a director of product at GitHub. I work on lots of data-related things. Amongst others is a new OSPO dashboard that after this session at 12:30 down in the demo stage, there's an opportunity to come see some work that we've been doing today. Open source program offices, or OSPOs, are kind of a really interesting new thing that businesses and organizations of all sizes are starting. They do lots of different things, manage legal, security, and best practices around open source. Some of them are responsible for improving engineering best practices at their organizations. Others are really invested in these deep open source strategies for their businesses. And so today we've got some folks with us who are going to tell us about their OSPOs at their organizations and what they're focused on. So just so we can calibrate a little bit with the room, just to show of hands, who knows what an OSPO is? Okay, that's good. Who has one at their organization? Okay, that's also good. Who here is running it at their organization? Okay. And who's thinking about starting one maybe, but doesn't have one? Are there any folks who are sort of OSPO interested but not sure? Yeah, okay, good. Okay. All right, great. So we have 4 great panelists today who are going to share their experience with us. So why don't you take it away and introduce yourselves? So Christine.
So my name is Christine Abernathy, and I am at F5, and I lead the Open Source Program Office.
Nice. Brittany.
Yeah, so I'm Brittany Eistenis. I am the Open Source Program Office Strategist for Fannie Mae. I focus a lot on open source contributions, inner source, community, DevRel, and all the gray areas in between.
My name is Per Plow. I am the Open Source Tech Lead at Spotify, leading our Open Source Program Office.
Hello, everyone. Sophia Vargas. I'm in Google's Open Source Programs Office as a program manager, but I like to refer to my role as a general purpose analyst, supporting our various teams across OSPO and outside of OSPO with data-related work. I'm also an active member of the CHAOSS community, where I work with external members on how to define project metrics for things like health and sustainability.
Cool. Well, welcome. And just so you know, we're going to save about 5 minutes for questions from you all at the end. So if you have questions you want to ask this group, there'll be time for that, and we'll probably just hang around outside afterwards. So maybe, Sophia, maybe you can start us off. I'm curious, like, what kind of decisions do you help Google with in the OSPO at Google? Like what?
Me personally?
Yeah. You or your team or your colleagues?
Yeah, so I mean, first and foremost, our organization is essentially responsible for how we engage in open source communities, both setting policies around how we both consume and release open source code, providing the central point of authority on license, compliance, use process, and offering tooling and support. In terms of what I support as an analyst, I'm generally looking for feedback metrics, how well are things being adopted, used, how are things changing, and try to provide input on how we need to adjust our programs.
Interesting. And what role does data play in that decision making? Is it a big part of your work?
Yes. And so I guess it wouldn't be a surprise that any operations team has a lot of metrics for feedback in terms of how programs are going. Are we doing well? Are things changing? Are people using our processes, or are they doing something else? I think from my work particularly, I focus more on better understanding engagement levels within open source across all of Alphabet. So understanding, is this growing, changing? Are our processes accessible? Are people complying? Are they sharing with us what they're doing? And whether or not we can identify areas that need to be adjusted. Say maybe it's taking too long to go through the release process. Can we fine tune that program to make it more accessible for more people at Google?
Interesting. What about the rest of you? What other things what decisions are you helping the business with at your organization, Brittany?
Yeah, so... Oh, sorry.
No, go for it.
You can go first,
okay.
Please.
So decisions, so we're a relatively newer open source program office. So what we're doing right now is we're getting ready to launch external contributions to open source projects from our engineers and our technologists to go out from a financial services company. So we are in the process of becoming like better corporate citizens because we care about the software that we consume and we care about the maintainers. So it's a pretty exciting time right now.
So we've been doing open source for 10 years. We have a quite large portfolio of various projects in various states. So a lot of the data we collect is to look at what is the health of different projects. Are we doing enough here? Is this actually something we're not really caring about anymore and should just archive, should be responsible about what we try to distribute? Then we also look at what do we have internally and look at our data for that thing as well. And does it make sense to release to the outside world?
Interesting. Christine, what about yourself?
So we're also pretty much a new open source program office. So some of the things that we're trying to think around is strategy and Open source is basically also using and releasing, publishing, or also contributing back. So some of the more interesting things that could be around data is, what are some of the open source projects or the key open source projects that you're consuming, and how do you become, as you said, a good open source citizen and contribute back to the ones that you strategically care about? So some of the data that could be useful is like what is actually being consumed. And then alongside that, maybe with some of the outside metrics, some of the more interesting things could be, what are some of those projects that are being consumed that need help, that maybe not the most popular, but ones that not only you care about, but in the industry as a whole cares about as well.
Right, so you're sort of hinting towards, I think, what Per said before, like health, right? This is one of these things that I think we talk a lot about in this sort of OSPO world, which is like, we want projects that we are building and maintaining to be healthy, or the ones that we're dependent upon to be healthy. And like, who wants to take a stab at like defining what that means? Maybe the chaos person at the end could have a go.
I mean, I always answer it with the awful answer of it depends.
Right.
So I look at it both at a macro portfolio level as well as in working with individual project teams on understanding what their goals are, because you can't really define success if you don't know what you're working toward. So it could be as simple as increasing engagement in the community, or ensuring that our external contributors have the same experience as our internal contributors without the same experience or resources available to them. So looking for signals that might say, how quickly are we responding to pull requests from non-Googlers, or how many of those pull requests are getting merged into the central project, as an indicator of whether or not we need to improve or fine-tune our documentation, templates, guidance, training in the external community. So that's just one example of ways that we are looking at what health means in that context, and then trying to set metrics against those goals.
Per, do you have like formal definitions, or?
No, so I think we try to go in the complete opposite direction. Not because this is great and this is valuable, and you're going so much into depth for this, and you're so much more an expert about this than I am. But we try to collect 4 smaller metrics that is actionable for our teams, and these are the 4 things you need to care about. We can always make it more advanced, but just starting small and say, this is like your activity you have the last 3 months. This is the number of contributors you have internally, externally. Do you have any security vulnerabilities? Do you have anything like stale, like issues or pull requests that you haven't reacted to? And we boil that down to like a score that's like red or green, basically.
Okay, so it's more like a scorecard just for the, nice. Okay, that's interesting. So, Christine, I know you've got some thoughts on sort of relationship between metrics that for OSPOs can track and security. What would you want this room to know about the kind of work that you all do in that space?
Yeah, for obviously open source is heavily used and consumed and popular, and security it's a big attack surface. So what does metrics play a role in it? And so some of the things that you would possibly be interested in, alongside the vulnerabilities that a project has, you also want to be thinking about, we talked about like the health, because in a sense, if the community is around it and is big and growing, it's kind of an indicator of security in the sense that bugs being fixed as fast as they come. So there's like an aspect of security in terms of like the project, health, and the community, but there could be other things. Again, like how many vulnerabilities are out there in a particular software. And there are like a lot of different people who are thinking about it. For example, deps.dev is a website where you can go and actually look at a lot of different metrics. There's like Open Source Security Foundation has a project called Scorecards, where you can look at how does a project kind of have all these like metrics around scoring, like what are the best practices that it's following? Do they have things like branch protection turned on, and all of these different things that you can actually score a project on. So these are some of the things that you want to kind of like, any open source project that you're consuming, you want to have some measure of like what are the metrics around what you term security. And again, it could depend on what it is that you're looking for. And one OSPO might think about security or look at all of the data and weight it separately. So some of those are the things that we have to be thinking about.
Right. And I guess it sounds like security is related to health in some sense, like a project sort of at risk if there's only one maintainer. Bus factor, that kind of thing.
So there's like that, is there only one maintainer, and some ecosystems, like a lot of JavaScript projects may only typically have like one maintainer. There are all of these research reports that say that some of the more popular packages out there are maintained by only a handful of people, but you have to be like mindful, if it's just one maintainer, if you're an OSPO, can you actually help them with more, maybe more than just donations, but your time as well? And in addition to that, there's the bus factor. And then if you have an open source project, what is like that diversity of like, are there big, how many companies are actually contributing to that project is also kind of like key to that.
Interesting. Yeah. How do you all think, sort of question to anybody who wants to answer really about, so when you're starting your own projects, companies might release packages to the world, and you might no longer have a maintainer in your own company anymore. Like, it might not be software that the team's really using anymore, but it's still on GitHub. Like, could you say something about how you think about sort of bus factor and sort of maintainership when you're educating your own colleagues about your open source properties?
So I always think, because there are so many projects with single maintainers, we try to cultivate a culture where there are multiple maintainers on the project. Because anybody could leave the company, anybody could abandon their project, and then what we would do is we would go and archive it and make it read-only. But if we have multiple maintainers on the project and we cultivate that culture of support, then that's a really strong way to start open source projects. So anytime anybody wants to put anything out in the open, coming on behalf of our company, Fannie Mae, there will always be more than one person, and we will always support them.
Yeah, we have the same kind of approach as well. We've had a long history of engineers being enabled to do what they feel is the right thing to do through autonomy and being driven by passion. But I think for us, a more stable ownership of a project is to boil it down to that there's a team that owns it. So it's a team decision. Also, because then it comes down to saying the team also has to make a call saying, okay, we own this thing and we do need to invest hours into this project to properly maintain it. And that's going to go away from the other team responsibilities that you do. So you kind of have to budget for that time as well. So that's the metric we look at. We look at, is there a team actually taking ownership of this? And then we also look at the activity that happens in the project and say, okay, what a percentage of that activity actually happens during working hours? So looking at like core working hours and weekends. And if you have a project that's maintained primarily in weekends and evenings and nights, it's a fairly good indicator that this is actually not something that might be a core business thing to actually care about.
Yeah.
We might say, maybe you should just have this as a private thing, and that's totally fine as well.
Yeah.
And then to add on top of that as well, so there are so many different paths that one can get into within open source. You don't necessarily have to be a classically trained engineer. So another great thing for open source projects is community management. So as a maintainer, sometimes you do feel like a lone wolf, but if you have somebody in your team, like on your side as your community person, they can help manage the intake and the consumption as well.
Right.
So yeah, it's a good track. Community managers, they're the best.
Yeah, Sophia, am I right in thinking Chaos has done some work on sort of like contributor roles and thinking about like what it means to actually, I guess, staff a project, if that makes sense?
We
Like
do. We
Okay.
have a metric that's different types of contributors and trying to enumerate more than just code and
Right.
getting more of a record of all the different ways that you can contribute to and support a project. And even with Chaos, we've been exploring with various ways to attribute contribution that isn't code-based or recorded in the versioning control system. So say development of a metric, it's a markdown file. It might have some Git history around it, but those initial conversations and discussions are happening in Zoom meetings. And so instead we'll have a record in that document that says who worked on it. And so we try to create our own ways of recording other styles of contribution that are not just based on version control systems.
Right, yeah. Okay, I think some folks in this room probably are thinking about starting an OSPO. And I think this is not an obvious, there's not an obvious playbook. I think it depends on the organization. I was going to say, maybe, Brittany, could you start us off, tell us a bit about your experiences of starting OSPOs, like what sort of organizations might want to do this? How would you recommend somebody get started?
It's a hoot, I'll tell you. One of the biggest things I would think when starting an open source program office or trying to cultivate that concept of good corporate citizenship is internal culture. We have to really educate our folks inside of our company to really understand the gravitas and the magnitude of how much open source software is being consumed and the importance of it. And so when you start sharing that sort of vision and that story, you get lots of folks on board and you get more folks excited about giving back into the open. Because many times when you're starting up an open source program office, there's possibly just maybe a third of your core engineering team gives back and understands what they're doing. But if you share that concept of community, it really grows. So I think it's really just starting off by sharing that cultural concept of the importance of open source. And then you can start growing all the other fun things that you do.
Does anyone else have anything to share on that?
One of the key things is, as you said, is that you want to take a look at the company that as you jump in and see where is open source either being used or consumed. What are the bottlenecks? So it might start with just going around and just talking to a whole bunch of people. What are their thoughts about open source? Where do they see the blockers? Are the policies that the company has favorable, or are they do they kind of like frown against open source? So just basically taking a temperature check on what is like the appetite for open source in the company is pretty important. And then after that, it's a matter of like, where does the company want to go and where does open source fit strategically into its business model? Some companies that do open source, it's not like open source. Open source might be something that they're doing, for example, it helps with recruiting.
Right.
But some companies, open source is part of like how they do business. And so the thinking around where open source fits in is going to be pretty important in that sense. And again, you have to get a sense of like up the chain, what is the executive support? Where do you see that they're going to be like the blockers in terms of if you want to roll this out, and how do you actually go around and tackle that?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I'm keen to learn as well failure modes that you've all seen. Like when do things go wrong in your experience for OSPOs or open source organizations? Do any of you have any sort of favorite stories to share?
I have a couple.
Go for it.
It's really easy to be a bottleneck if you are the sole authority on what licenses you can both use and consume. And so having some way to distribute that responsibility so it's not all going through one person in a 100,000 plus person company can be a bit cumbersome. I also like to remind that as a very large company, we consume and contribute a lot of open source software. And sometimes the person who imported that package left years ago. And so while that person was accountable when they were there originally, they're no longer part of our organization. And when something like a prominent vulnerability or CVE is released, and there's no person attached to be accountable for that repository, it might fall to you. So we had a very busy last December, just sort of accounting for all the various open-ended pieces that are in our organization. So just you might end up having to be responsible for things even if you're just trying to provide guidance.
Yeah. Per, have you seen open source program officers fail?
Yeah, I've seen them iterate into various modes. So maybe
Okay.
it's not failure, maybe it's just like developing as a function. I think because of the topic spreads across the entire organization, typically you can fall into this mode of trying to cover too much and not really set boundaries. So where is like your boundary between you and legal? And because how do you define that?
Right.
And sometimes also how people work with open source also goes into like HR territory. And some of it goes into like technology decisions and strategy for like what kind of bigger systems do you take in. So you can easily spread over too much and just try to be everywhere.
Right.
And then you get nothing done. So I think as a team to kind of be effective, you have to kind of find the areas where you know you can have an impact, and then kind of align with the other functions in the organization to handle those. Make sure that legal is kind of on board with what you're doing and so on, so you don't become like a legal bottleneck without being a lawyer. That's
Right.
not the best place you want to be.
That makes sense. So there's if I can just play that back, you're saying there's a sort of risk that the remit of an OSPO can be so incredibly broad. It's generally a small team, and you can just get overwhelmed and actually become ineffective.
If you look at any tech company, you can see open source is probably part of most of what they actually do.
Right.
Down to like the dependencies to the infrastructure and so on, and also what the engineers want to do. So if you feel the OSPO should be part of every conversation about open source, you have to kind of be everywhere, and that doesn't work.
Right.
So you have to kind of find where it makes sense for you to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then CLAs. I mean, if you're starting up new open source program offices, if you are going to be contributing new projects, please just put a DCO on it. No CLAs.
Fax us your signature.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Oh, no, and no,
Pretty sure
actually,
I've seen that.
sometimes you have to like hand mail.
Yes.
No, a lot of it is also around like automation. When you're talking about where OSPOs fail is just there's like the aspect of like there's the people and like there's an automation part of it. So the people aspect where things can get really tricky is that the internal relationships that you need to work with, because open source works with so many like product teams, the legal teams, engineering teams. Like there's so many hats that sometimes you need to wear. So you have to like be kind of savvy in the people aspect for it. And then there's like the external community, like you've got like, so people are unpredictable. So where you have to really be good at like managing all of those people parts of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. So A term that you'll hear a fair amount these days, I hear a lot, I've heard a lot at this conference already, is inner source. Roughly speaking, inner source is work like an open source community, but within, behind the firewall of your organization. So adopt some of the same practices for collaboration and sharing and reuse. Christine, what's your sort of experience of inner source at companies and how it's the same as open source and the work of an OSPO, and how it's different, I guess? What would you want us to know about that?
So I joined F5 about a year ago, and a lot of the engineering teams, just the nature of acquisition and all, are very siloed, and some of the code's not shared, which is not what my experience was. So inner source it's actually sometimes like a stepping stone to getting people thinking with an open source mindset. So the ability to share code internally, and then using all of the best practices around open source can allow people to share code and develop products that they can reuse across. So that's kind of like where I see inner source can help break down silos. It can help build community, and it can help basically just get people into the habit of what does open source look like, so that if you actually then move into open source, well, it's not really foreign.
Yeah. Interesting. And do you think OSPOs should be responsible for inner source strategy as well? Do you think that's a good fit? Do you think that's a different team's job, or?
Yeah, well, we inherited the inner source work as well, but
okay.
so there's some things that are very similar, there's metrics parts of it where you can be looking at the same thing. What's the adoption of my particular component within the entire company? So there's some things that you're thinking about that are similar. You may not be thinking as much in the legal aspects. And then a lot of projects might go through the pipeline from it becomes inner source and it eventually becomes open source. So that's where it might be a good fit for for the same team.
Interesting. Okay, I'm just paying attention to time. We're going to save the last 5 minutes for questions. So I just want to skip ahead to a couple of future-looking topics. I guess open question to you all. What's the thing that you're most excited about that's happening in the sort of OSPO world right now, whether it's sort of research that's happening in academia that's helping us better understand community health, new tools and technologies, or OSPOs. We heard about OSPO at the World Health Organization in the last keynote, which was super cool to learn about. Just open the floor. I don't know. Why don't you start us off, Per, with anything you are interested in?
So I think for me personally, I think the conversation about sustainability and viability and maintainers and their maintainer burnout, I think that's a good conversation to have. What kind of worries me a little bit is that we also keep steering it back to how can companies reduce the risk without actually solving the problem. But I think it's good that the conversation is happening. It's also the funding announcement, the accelerator announcement yesterday that GitHub made. It's a sign that the industry is slowly changing and trying to come to terms with how do we find a sustainable way of having this ecosystem in place.
Yeah. Sophia, do you have any things that's particularly interesting to you that's happening?
I've been really excited with all the academic work that's happening right now and better understanding open source ecosystems, community structures, and what again, on the topic of sustainability, what things really make a difference. And I'm personally very interested in following the new emerging financial structures, especially as a large corporation. We try to give back in all the ways that are effective at maintaining a community, maintaining a project. But now there's so many more options. And so knowing what is actually going to be the most helpful in ensuring the long-term viability of a project or a community or maintainer. I don't think we really know yet. We're kind of testing them out. And I think that's really exciting. I'm really excited to see the evolution of the industry such that we all depend on these things. We're finding better ways to support them that allow the entire ecosystem to benefit.
Nice.
I just think more OSPOs. I think that's great. Pardon me. There's dust. So the United States government is going to start putting open source program offices into every particular sector, which is exciting. There are amazing things that are happening in Europe, and there's open source program offices that are popping up everywhere. And community is huge, so that's what I'm really excited about.
So multi-sector, multinational.
Exactly.
What about yourself, Christine?
That's exactly what I was going to say.
Okay.
With the kind
Still
of
your
focus on
answer.
security. That is my answer. Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, look, we've got about 5 minutes left. I'd love to get some questions from folks in the room. Who'd like to? I think I saw you first. We've got a mic that's going to come round so folks online can hear you. Just the lady in third row at the front.
Oh my goodness.
Yep. Just here.
Don't have to go gadget.
Oh yeah. Sorry. We need to.
So I have a question about inner sourcing. I know Google might be doing a lot of inner sourcing, and do you face any challenges in respect to the release management of those products? because a lot of internal teams might be contributing to that. And also, do you see a challenge opening up that inner source project to the outside community as an open source project from the licensing or IP perspective, because you have to go through a big process to make it an open source project?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, again, really can be very dependent on the individual case. And I think sort of, again, I love Per's comment on sort of the challenge of being too many places at once, because I definitely feel that as a company that has thousands of projects and components that we're working on constantly. And I think within OSPO, what we've been thinking more about is how to create better bridges between internal systems and external systems, knowing that we have our own version control systems and we use GitHub for a lot of our external project and our external work. And so if we know something is going to eventually become something public, then we advise a different set of tooling, a different set of infrastructure so that that transition is simpler versus having to copy everything over, adopt a new issue tracker, adopt a new mechanism, adopt a new process, create new documentation. It can be pretty disruptive to pull something out of an internal model and put it in an external model. And so we try to advise where we can up front for more trying to build for an open source first approach, even if it's not open source yet, so that that transition is smoother, because it's really easy to use a bunch of internal tooling that just suddenly becomes unavailable. And so I think that it's kind of a tricky model to balance, because I think some things might never leave our company, and so like it's not necessary, and we have so many resources internally that it's much easier to use all those things. So I think it can be very much case by case, but as OSPO, we're trying to make more consistent infrastructure and tooling available for these external first models, as well as a bridge between the internal to external systems to allow that. Because sometimes even when you externalize something, you're still using those internal tools. So how are you copying between it? How are you maintaining a single point of truth, especially for something like issue tracking, which gets really complex when you're getting issues coming in from the external community and you have to replicate those internally and prioritize, triage them, and then still communicate back externally what happened. And so we've seen any and all of the above. So again, as OSPO, trying to provide some consistency and guidance to try to reduce the complexity overall.
Thank you.
Just to add on top of that really quick too, the concept of building open source first, many companies, you have a particular set of licenses, you need to think in that sense, if you think this inner source project is going to be viable, your novel code could be patentable, but if you're building with multiple different libraries, think about the licenses and think about that, so.
Okay, let's try and get a couple more questions in. Yeah, lady at front, thanks. And then I've got you next.
Hi. I love that you said that more OSPOs is more excitement, right? I'm, as someone who's helping lead the OSPO at Adobe, I'm wondering how can we all, multiple OSPOs, around the country, around the world, how can we all communicate and create our own community as OSPOs?
So there is the Linux Foundation has a to-do group. You can find them on Slack, but you can go to todogroup.org. Yeah, and get more information, because that's exactly what it is. It's like it started for OSPOs to communicate and share best practices.
And we're all in the community. So
okay,
you could reach
great.
us there, to-do group.
TODO group.
Yeah, to-do. Talk openly,
Awesome.
Develop openly.
Yeah.
I think we heard about it, but we hadn't really.
Okay.
Great question. Yep.
Thanks. So I just had a question about when OSPOs are setting their missions and their strategies. Do you, or even just generally, interact much with developer relations teams and developer advocates, and what does that relationship look like?
If we could all have our own DevRel offices inside of the OSPO, or folks dedicated to DevRel, but speaking for myself, and I don't want to necessarily speak for everyone here, we are DevRel. That's essentially how we run that, but ideally that's such an important role.
Yeah, so we definitely do interact with DevRel, and some of the folks, like sometimes each little project maybe have its own community engineering, its own sort of DevRel, and even supporting dev advocates that look over it. And so we're just interacting with them to make sure if there's anything they need, any tooling, et cetera, that's something that we would be helping build, because we're sitting a level up and doing it at scale.
So we are a consumer-facing company, so our DevRel team is mostly concerned with the APIs and so on we make available to developers in that sense. But specifically for Spotify, we have something as exotic as a platform marketing team, which is basically put in there to kind of market our platform and things we do, and that also include open source. So that's a sparring partner for me.
All right, and I'm seeing 4 seconds left on the clock, so I'm going to stop us there. And thanks to all the panel participants today for a great discussion. We'll stick around for some more questions questions, and thanks for your engagement. So, well done.
Thank you.